Hello, book lovers. Welcome to another session 11 of the guided reading of Anne Bronte's Agnes Grey. We're reaching the end of this literary journey, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. But before we begin, I would like to share something with you. I would like to tell you something very special. So there is a brand new course at Books and Culture, a masterclass called An Introduction to Victorian Literature. As you are well aware, I am passionate about the 19th century, and Victorian literature is my area of expertise. I teach 19th century literature at university. My research is on 19th century literature and theater. I was very excited to put together this masterclass and share some of my knowledge and my passion with you um, via Books and Culture. So you can access it right away. It's a masterclass divided into four parts. In the first part, I give you an overview, a cultural, social, historical overview of the context of the time, what was going on. In part one, we talk about the Condition of England novel, and we discuss two authors, Charles Dickens and Elizabeth Gaskell. All the authors mentioned in this course are must read authors, and I'm sure you're going to add quite a few titles to your to be read list as you watch the lessons. Part three is about the regional novel, and we discuss Thomas Hardy and George Eliot. George Eliot is amazing. And finally, in part four, we talk about the sensation novel, and we discuss the authors Wilkie Collins and Mary Elizabeth Braddon. So, if you're excited to know more about the Victorian period, it's a short course, it's a masterclass divided into four parts, so you can fit it in your weekly schedule, and I'm sure you're going to have a great time. So the masterclass is available. All you have to do is go to the website booksandculture.club. Check all that is available on Books and Culture. I've created a lot of courses throughout the years, but the most recent one is An Introduction to Victorian Literature, and you can um, purchase it and access the masterclass right away. Excellent. So today in our session, we're going to talk about chapters 20 and 21. But before we do that, let's recap what we read last time. Last time we read chapters 18 and 19. Chapter 18 was a very good one. It was called Mirth and Mourning. Look at the essence in the title, Mirth and Mourning. Both words start with M, but they give opposite meanings, right? And in this chapter, we learn that Rosalie is married, and she's delighted with the excitement and travels and entertainment, and that she hopes she's about to experience. But at the same time, she dreads her future as Lady Ashby. So there you go, the combination of mirth and mourning. And Agnes also feels mirth and mourning. She has another encounter with Mr. Weston. And in this encounter, he remembers that she liked bluebells. So he collects some, he gathers some bluebells and brings them to her. And she's delighted and she's full of hopes and dreams. But all that is crushed when she receives a letter from home informing of her father's illness. So she departs immediately, even though Mrs. Murray did not think it was necessary for her to go with such speed. But Agnes goes, but unfortunately, she arrives too late. When she arrives, her father has already passed away. So the chapter starts very joyful. So she feels mirth, but it ends very sadly. And it's all about mourning her father, who was such a beloved person to her and her family. And chapter 19, a short chapter called The Letter, um, we learn that Agnes and her mother plan to start a boarding school. So her mother wants to find a way to secure financial stability for herself. She does not want to be a burden for her daughters, especially Mary, the oldest, who is married. So she wants Mary to take care of her own family. And then she decides to start this business with Agnes so they can work together and provide for themselves. So they want to create this school for girls, a boarding school for girls. And Agnes accepts. So she has to go back to Horton Lodge to say goodbye to everyone, including Mr. Weston. But before she goes, so the mother receives a letter from her father. She had not heard anything from her family ever since she decided to get married to her husband, to Mr. Grey, because the match was not accepted by the family. So the family cut ties with Mrs. Grey. She used to be a lady, but then because uh, her choice of husband was not accepted, she was not helped financially by the family anymore. And in this letter, the audacity of her father, he says that he can make her a lady again if she acknowledges that the past 30 years with her husband had been a mistake. But she cannot do that. She says the past 30 years were the best of her life. Hers was a love match, different from Rosalie's, which was definitely a business match. Um, so she cannot do that, and her daughters are very proud of her decision. So they have to find a way to make do, be what they are, independent women, without um, Mrs. Gray's family's help. So let's start with chapter 20 called The Farewell. A house in A, so that's a place. They don't, the Brontes don't specify places. So just the first letter and a dash. So a house in A, the fashionable watering place, was hired for our seminary, and a promise of 2 or 3 pupils was obtained to commence with. I returned to Harton Lodge about the middle of July, leaving my mother to conclude the bargain for the house, to obtain more pupils, to sell off the furniture of our old abode, and to fit out the new one. We often pity the poor because they have no leisure to mourn their departed relatives, and necessity obliges them to labor through their severest afflictions. But is not active employment the best remedy for overwhelming sorrow, the surest antidote for despair? And here there is an interesting footnote about this idea of activity and being busy and doing things in order to, where is it here, in order to deal with loss and grief was quite common at the time. So here it says many Victorians, including Thomas Carlyle, would have supported this sentiment. For instance, Carlyle writes in book 3 of Past and Present, a very good book, um, nonfiction, right? Doubt, desire, sorrow, remorse, indignation, despair itself. All these, like hell dogs, lie beleaguering the soul of the poor day worker, as of every man. But he bends himself with free valor against his task, and all this are stilled. So if you keep your mind busy, your body busy, you will not suffer from these hell dogs, as he puts it, as as much. So that's the way she decides to cope with everything. She's kind of forced into it, right? To remain busy. It may be a rough comforter. It may seem hard to be harassed with the cares of life when we have no relish for its enjoyments, to be goaded to labor when the heart is ready to break, and the vexed spirit implores for rest only to weep in silence. But is not labor better than the rest we covet? And are not those petty, tormenting cares less hurtful than a continual brooding over the great affliction that oppresses us? Besides, we cannot have cares and anxieties and toil without hope. If it be but the hope of fulfilling our joyless task, accomplishing some needful project, or escaping some further annoyance. At any rate, I was glad my mother had so much employment for every faculty of her action-loving frame. Our kind neighbors lamented that she, once so exalted in wealth and station, should be reduced to such extremity in her time of sorrow. but I am persuaded that she would have suffered thrice as much had she been left in affluence, with liberty to remain in that house, the scene of her early happiness and late affliction, and no stern necessity to prevent her from incessantly brooding over and lamenting her bereavement. I will not dilate upon the feelings with which I left the old house, the well-known garden, the little village church, then doubly dear to me because my father, who for 30 years had taught and prayed within its walls, lay slumbering now beneath its flags. And the old bare hills, delightful in their very desolation, with the narrow vales between, smiling in green wood and sparkling water. The house where I was born, the scene of all my early associations, the place where throughout life my earthly affections had been centered, and left them to return no more. True, I was going back to Horton Lodge, where, amid many evils, one source of pleasure yet remained, but it was pleasure mingled with excessive pain, and my stay, alas, was limited to 6 weeks. Now, here, as Agnes is saying goodbye to her childhood home, it reminds me of Marianne Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, the first text we read together in these guided reading sessions in the channel here at Books and Culture. Um, to look at all those very known places where she had spent so much of her life, where both Agnes and Marianne, where they had um, created so many memories. And here in the case of Agnes, where she had seen her father um, and where his presence still remained, to let it all go, knowing that they would never return, is very painful, right? But it's also a necessary step in order to move forward. Agnes even says, if my mom had to stay here in the same house and without any activity to occupy her body and mind, she would be thrice as sad. All right. But now that she has to go back to Horton Lodge, although only for 6 weeks, a place she does not love, but there is one source of consolation, and that is, of course, Mr. Weston. I'm curious to know how they will say goodbye. And even of that precious time, day after day slipped by, and I did not see him. Except the church, I never saw him for a fortnight after my return. It seemed a long time to me, and as I was often with my rambling pupil, of course hopes would keep rising and disappointments would ensue. And then I would say to my own heart, here is a convincing proof, if you would but have the sense to see it, or the candor to acknowledge it, that he does not care for you. If he only thought half as much about you as you do about him, he would have contrived to meet you many times ere this. You must know that by consulting your own feelings. Therefore, have done with this nonsense. You have no ground for hope. Dismiss at once these hurtful thoughts and foolish wishes from your mind, and turn to your own duty and the dull, blank life that lies before you. You might have known such happiness was not for you. That's so sad, right? She thinks, well, those dreams were so foolish. I do not deserve this happiness that she was creating in her mind. But I saw him at last. He came suddenly upon me as I was crossing a field in returning from a visit to Nancy Brown, which I had taken the opportunity of paying while Matilda Murray was riding her matchless mare. He must have heard of the heavy loss I had sustained. He expressed no sympathy, offered no condolence, but almost the first words he uttered were, "How is your mother?" And this was no matter of course question, for I never told him that I had a mother. He must have learned the fact from others, if he knew it at all, and besides, there was sincere goodwill and even deep, touching, unobtrusive sympathy in the tone and manner of the inquiry. I thanked him with due civility and told him she was as well as could be expected. What will she do? Was the next question. Many would have deemed it an impertinent one and given an evasive reply, but such an idea never entered my head, and I gave a brief but plain statement of my mother's plans and prospects. Then you will leave this place shortly, said he. Yes, in a month. He paused a minute as if in thought. When he spoke again, I hoped it would be to express his concern at my departure, but it was only to say, I should think you will be willing enough to go. Yes, for some things, I replied. For some things only. I wonder what should make you regret it. I was annoyed at this, in some degrees because it embarrassed me. I had only one reason for regretting it, and that was a profound secret which he had no business to trouble me about. Why, said I, why should you suppose that I dislike the place? You told me so yourself, was the decisive reply. You said, at least, that you could not live contentedly without a friend, and that you had no friend here, and no possibility of making one, and besides, I know you must dislike it. But, if you remember rightly, I said, or meant to say, I could not live contentedly without a friend in the world. I was not so unreasonable as to require one always near me. I think I could be happy in a house full of enemies if— But no, that sentence must not be continued. I paused and hastily added, and besides, we cannot well leave a place where we have lived for 2 or 3 years without some feeling of regret. Will you regret to part with Miss Murray, your sole remaining pupil and companion? I dare say I shall, in some degree. It was not without sorrow I parted with her sister. I can imagine that. Well, Miss Matilda is quite as good, better in one respect. What is that? She's honest. And the other one is not? I should not call her dishonest, but it must be confessed she's a little artful. Artful, is she? I saw she was giddy and vain, and now, he added after a pause, I can well believe she was artful too, but so excessively so as to assume an aspect of extreme simplicity and unguarded openness. Yes, continued he musingly, that accounts for some little things that puzzled me a trifle before. After that, he turned the conversation to more general subjects. He did not leave me till we had nearly reached the park gates. He had certainly stepped a little out of his way to accompany me so far, for he now went back and disappeared down Moss Lane, the entrance of which we had passed some time before. Assuredly, I did not regret this circumstance. If sorrow had any place in my heart, it was that he was gone at last, that he was no longer walking by my side, and that short interval of delightful intercourse was at an end. He had not breathed a word of love, or dropped one hint of tenderness or affection, and yet I had been supremely happy to be near him, to hear him talk, as he did talk, and to feel that he thought me worthy to be so spoken to, capable of understanding and duly appreciating such discourse, was enough. Yes, Edward Weston, I could indeed be happy in a house full of enemies if I had but one friend who truly, deeply, and faithfully loved me, and if that friend were you, though we might be far apart, seldom to hear from each other, still more seldom to meet, though toil and trouble and vexation might surround me, still it would be too much happiness for me to dream of. Yet, who can tell? Said I within myself as I proceeded up the park. Who can tell what this 1 month may bring forth? I have lived nearly 23 years, and I have suffered much, and tasted little pleasure yet. Is it likely my life all through will be so clouded? Is it not possible that God may hear my prayers, disperse these gloomy shadows, and grant me some beams of heaven's sunshine yet? Will he entirely deny to me those blessings which are so freely given to others, who neither ask them nor acknowledge them when received? May I not still hope and trust? She's talking to herself now, so she would be happy if she could only have Mr. Weston as a confidant, as a friend, even if they did not meet at all, just to know that he would think of her sometimes, that they would, I don't know, exchange letters, that they would have a sort of communication. And it's very sad to think the way she describes her life, that she has had a lot of suffering, little pleasure, and that her life has been so clouded for such a young woman, right? 23 years old. But she still has hope, she continues. I did hope and trust for a while, but alas, alas, the time ebbed away. One week followed another, and excepting one distant glimpse and two transient meetings, during which scarcely anything was said, while I was walking with Miss Matilda, I saw nothing of him, except, of course, at church. And now the last Sunday was come, and the last service. I was often on the point of melting into tears during the sermon, the last I was to hear from him. The best I should hear from anyone, I was well assured. It was over. The congregation were departing, and I must follow. I had then seen him and heard his voice, too probably for the last time. In the churchyard, Matilda was pounced upon by the two Misses Green. They had many inquiries to make about her sister, and I know not what besides. I only wished they would have done, that we might hasten back to Horton Lodge. I longed to see the retirement of my own room, or some sequestered nook in the grounds, that I might deliver myself up to my feelings, to weep my last farewell, and lament my false hopes and vain delusions. Only this once, and then adieu to fruitless dreaming. Thenceforth, only sober, solid, sad reality. Look at the use of the as here. Sober, solid, sad reality should occupy my mind. But while I thus resolved, a low voice close beside me said, I suppose you are going this week, Miss Grey? Yes, I replied. I was very much startled, and had I been at all hysterically inclined, I certainly should have committed myself in some way then. Thank God I was not. Well, said Mr. Weston, I want to bid you good-bye. It is not likely I shall see you again before you go. Good-bye, Mr. Weston, I said. Oh, how I struggled to say it calmly. I gave him my hand. He retained it a few seconds in his. It is possible we may meet again, said he. Will it be of any consequence to you whether we do or not? Yes, I should be very glad to see you again. I could say no less. He kindly pressed my hand and went. Now I was happy again, though more inclined to burst into tears than ever. If I had been forced to speak at that moment, a succession of sobs would have inevitably ensued, and as it was, I could not keep the water out of my eyes. I walked along with Miss Murray, turning aside my face, and neglecting to notice several successive remarks, till she bawled out I was either deaf or stupid, and then, having recovered my self-possession, as one awakened from a fit of abstraction, I suddenly looked up and asked what she had been saying. A lot of ups and downs in this chapter called The Farewell. So she was there for 6 weeks and she thought, well, a lot can happen in a month, over a month. But nothing happened. She would only see him at church. And then on the very last day, when she was about to lose it, she could almost not control her tears because she thought that would be the last she ever saw or heard of him or heard him. He comes and asks if it would be okay to see her again. And now she's happy again. Her hopes are up again. But she has to leave Horton Lodge, right? Now let's start chapter 21, which is called The School. I left Horton Lodge and went to join my mother in our new abode at A. I found her well in health, resigned in spirit, and even cheerful, though subdued and sober in her general demeanor. We had only 3 boarders and half a dozen day pupils to commence with, but by due care and diligence we hoped ere long to increase the number of both. I set myself with befitting energy to discharge the duties of this new mode of life. I call it new, for there was indeed a considerable difference between working with my mother in a school of our own, and working as a hireling among strangers, despised and trampled upon by old and young. And for the first few weeks I was by no means unhappy. It is possible we may meet again, and will it be of any consequence to you whether we do or do not? Those words still rang in my ear and rested on my heart. They were my secret solace and support. I shall see him again. He will come, or he will write. No promise, in fact, was too bright or too extravagant for Hope, with a capital H, to whisper in my ear. I did not believe half of what she told me, she, Hope. I pretended to laugh at it all, but I was far more credulous than I myself supposed. Otherwise, why did my heart leap up when a knock was heard at the front door, and the maid who opened it came to tell my mother a gentleman wished to see her? And why was I out of humor for the rest of the day because it proved to be a music master come to offer his services to the school? And what stopped my breath for a moment when the postman having brought a couple of letters, my mother said, "Here, Agnes, this is for you," and threw one of them to me, and what made the hot blood rush into my face when I saw it was directed in a gentleman's hand? And why, oh, why did that cold, sickening sense of disappointment fall upon me when I had torn open the cover and found it was only a letter from Mary, which, for some reason or other, her husband had directed for her? Was it then come to this, that I should be disappointed to receive a letter from my only sister, and because it was not written by a comparative stranger? Dear Mary, and she had written it so kindly, and thinking I should be so pleased to have it. I was not worthy to read it. And I believe in my indignation against myself, I should have put it aside till I had schooled myself into a better frame of mind, and was become more deserving of the honor and privilege of its perusal. But there was my mother looking on and wishful to know what news it contained. So I read it and delivered it to her, and then went into the schoolroom to attend to the pupils. But amidst the cares of copies and sums, in the intervals of correcting errors here and reproving derelictions of duty there, I was inwardly taking myself to task with far sterner severity. What a fool you must be, said my head to my heart, or my sterner to my softer self. How could you ever dream that he would write to you? What grounds have you for such a hope? Or that he will see you, or give himself any trouble about you, or even think of you again? What grounds? And then Hope, the capital H, set before me the last short interview and repeated the words I had so faithfully treasured in my memory. Well, and what was there in that? Who ever hung his hopes upon so frail a twig? What was there in those words that my common acquaintance might not say to another? Of course, it was possible you might meet again. He might have said so if you had been going to New Zealand. But that did not imply any intention of seeing you. And then, as to the question that followed, anyone might ask that. And how did you answer? Merely with a stupid, commonplace reply, such as you would have given to Master Murray or anyone else you had been so tolerably on tolerably civil terms with. But then, persisted Hope, the tone and manner in which he spoke. Oh, that is nonsense. He always speaks impressively. And at that moment, there were the Greens and Miss Matilda Murray just before, and other people passing by, and he was obliged to stand close beside you and to speak very low, unless he wished everybody to hear what he said, which, though it was nothing at all particular, of course, he would rather not. But then, above all, that emphatic yet gentle pressure of the hand, which seemed to say, "Trust me," and many other things besides, too delightful, almost too flattering to be repeated, even to oneself. Egregious folly, too absurd to require contradiction, mere inventions of the imagination, which you ought to be ashamed of, if you would but consider your own unattractive exterior, your unamiable reserve, your foolish diffidence, which must make you appear cold, dull, awkward, and perhaps ill-tempered too. If you had but rightly considered this from the beginning, you would never have harbored such presumptuous thoughts. And now that you have been so foolish, pray repent and amend, and let us have no more of it. So it's like a battle going on in her mind. Her Hope, capital H, her softer self, arguing with her sterner self, with reality, with rationality. And she just cannot make up her mind. She keeps reliving that very last moment with Mr. Weston, and reliving those last words. And every time she has a different interpretation. I'm sure you've been through this as well, right? We all have. When we want something so much and we keep looking back, trying to find small pieces of hope, reinterpreting things in this light, in that light, trying to predict the future, right? Especially when love is um, is in question. I cannot say that I implicitly obeyed my own injunctions, but such reasoning as this became more and more effective as time wore on and nothing was seen or heard of Mr. Weston, until at last I gave up hoping, for even my heart acknowledged it was all in vain. But still I would think of him. I would cherish his image in my mind, and treasure every word, look, and gesture that my memory could retain, and brood over his excellences and his peculiarities, and, in fact, all I had seen, heard, or imagined respecting him. Agnes, this sea air and change of scene do you no good, I think. I never saw you look so wretched. It must be that you sit too much and allow the cares of the schoolroom to worry you. You must learn to take things easy and to be more active and cheerful. You must take exercise whenever you can get it and leave the most tiresome duties to me. They will only serve to exercise my patience and perhaps try my temper a little. So said my mother as we sat at work one morning during the Easter holidays. I assured her that my employments were not at all oppressive, that I was well, or if there was anything amiss, it would be gone as soon as the trying months of spring were over. When summer came, I should be as strong and hearty as she could wish to see me. But inwardly her observation startled me. I knew my strength was declining, my appetite had failed, and I was grown listless and desponding. And if indeed he could never care for me, and I could never see him more, if I was forbidden to minister to his happiness, forbidden for ever to taste the joys of love, to bless and to be blessed, then life must be a burden, and if my heavenly Father would call me away, I should be glad to rest. But it would not do to die and leave my mother, selfish, unworthy daughter, to forget her for a moment. Was not her happiness committed in a great measure to my charge, and the welfare of our young pupils too? Should I shrink from the work that God had set before me because it was not fitted to my taste? Did not He know best what I should do and where I ought to labor? And should I long to quit His service before I had finished my task, and expect to enter into His rest without having labored to earn it? No. By his help I will arise and address myself diligently to my appointed duty. If happiness in this world is not for me, I will endeavor to promote the welfare of those around me, and my reward shall be hereafter. So from that moment on, she decides, well, happiness is not for me in this life. I'm not meant to love or be loved. So I will live for the happiness of others, especially her mother. So said I in my heart, and from that hour I only permitted my thoughts to wander to Edward Weston, or at least to dwell upon him now and then, as a treat for rare occasions. And whether it was really the approach of summer, or the effect of these good resolutions, or the lapse of time, or all together, tranquillity of mind was soon restored, and bodily health and vigor began likewise, slowly but surely, to return. Early in June I received a letter from Lady Ashby, late Miss Murray. She had written to me twice or thrice before, from the different stages of her bridal tour, always in good spirits and professing to be very happy. I wondered every time that she had not forgotten me in the midst of such much gaiety and variety of scene. At length, however, there was a pause, and it seemed she had forgotten me, for upwards of 7 months passed away and no letter. Of course, I did not break my heart about that, though I often wondered how she was getting on. And when this last epistle so unexpectedly arrived, I was glad enough to receive it. It was dated from Ashby Park, where she was come to settle down at last, having previously divided her time between the continent and the metropolis. She made many apologies for having neglected me so long, assured me she had not forgotten me, and had often intended to write, etc., etc., but always been prevented by something. She acknowledged that she had been leading a very dissipated life, and I should think her very wicked and very thoughtless. But notwithstanding that, she thought a great deal, and among other things, that she should vastly like to see me. We have been several days here already, wrote she. We have not a single friend with us, and are likely to be very dull. You know, I never had a fancy for living with my husband like two turtles in a nest. Were he the most delightful creature that ever wore a coat, so do take pity upon me and come. I suppose your midsummer holidays commence in June, the same as the other people's. Therefore, you cannot plead want of time, and you must and shall come. In fact, I shall die if you don't. I want you to visit me as a friend and stay a long time. There is nobody with me, as I told you before, but Sir Thomas and old Lady Ashby. But you needn't mind them. They will trouble us but little with their company, and you shall have a room to yourself whenever you like to retire to it, and plenty of books to read when my company is not sufficiently amusing. I forget whether you like babies. If you do, you may have the pleasure of seeing mine, the most charming child in the world, no doubt, and all the more so that I am not troubled with nursing it. I was determined I wouldn't be bothered with that. Unfortunately, it's a girl, and Sir Thomas has never forgiven me. But, however, if you will only come, I promise you shall be its governess as soon as it can speak. So she's had a baby. Unfortunately, it's a girl. Very matter of fact, she says that because, of course, um, the title, the estate, the property would all be inherited by a male heir. So would not be inherited by this little girl. So Sir Thomas still has no heir. And she says she's not bothered. She wouldn't be bothered to nurse or wouldn't be troubled to nurse the baby, to breastfeed the baby, right? Here's an interesting cultural note. Let me see if I can find it. Rosalie's choice to use a wet nurse, so to have someone else breastfeed the baby for her, is not typical of her era. By the middle of the 19th century, this previously common practice among the upper classes was not considered as socially acceptable as it had been. So her choice to not breastfeed the baby is very personal. It was not common at the time anymore. But you see, she has, by the way, she writes about the girl that she doesn't have a love bond with the baby, not yet in any case. She refers to it as it and says, unfortunately, it's a girl. Um, Too young, perhaps. Um, and well, she's not in love with Sir Thomas, so the fruit of their relationship is not something she can cherish, right? Um, But I promise you shall be its governess as soon as it can speak, and you shall bring it up in the way it should go, and make a better woman of it than its mamma. And you shall see my poodle too, a splendid little charmer imported from Paris, and two fine Italian paintings of great value. She is more excited to talk about the poodle and the paintings than her baby, right? I forget the artist. Doubtless you will be able to discover prodigious beauties in them, which you must point out to me, as I only admire by hearsay. And many elegant curiosities besides, which I purchased at Rome and elsewhere. And finally, you shall see my new home, the splendid house and grounds I used to covet so greatly. Alas, how far the promise of anticipation exceeds the pleasure of possession! There's a fine sentiment. I assure you I am become quite a grave old matron. Pray come, if it be only to witness the wonderful change. Write by return of post and tell me when your vacation commences, and say that you will come the day after and stay till the day before it closes. In mercy to yours affectionately, Rosalie Ashby. I showed this strange episode to my mother and consulted her on what I ought to do. She advised me to go, and I went, willingly enough, to see Lady Ashby, and her baby too, and to do anything I could to benefit her by consolation or advice. For I imagined she must be unhappy, or she would not have applied to me thus. But feeling, as may readily be conceived, that in accepting the invitation I made a great sacrifice for her, and did violence to my feelings in many ways, instead of being delighted with the honorable distinction of being entreated by the baronet's lady to visit her as a friend. However, I determined my visit should be only for a few days at most, and I will not deny that I derived some consolation from the idea that, as Ashby Park was not very far from Horton, I might possibly see Mr. Weston, or at least hear something about him. And that is the end of chapter 21, called The School. The next chapter, chapter 22, is called The Visit. So I'm very curious to read about her time spent with Lady Ashby and if they come across Mr. Weston. And chapter 23 is called The Park. So next session will be the one before the last. So we're almost at the end of this journey, as I said in the beginning of today's session. I hope you're enjoying this book. I really am. I really am enjoying this novel. Let me know in the comments, how do you feel about Agnes's feelings to Mr. Weston? Do you think her hopes were really crushed? Or is this visit to Ashby Park going to bring it all back to the surface? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget, if you want to know more about Victorian literature, sign up right away for the masterclass, An Introduction to Victorian Literature, on the website booksandculture.club, and watch the masterclass right away. I am sure you will love it. So thank you so much for watching this session, for being here with me today, and I will see you next time.